For this problem, I'm going to show you how to graph this trigonometric function using two different ways. So in the class, I've been using inequalities to graph a trigonometric function. Many of you guys have maybe learned the phase shift. I'll show both of them, but I'm mainly going to be using the inequalities because I've already taught it that way, so I'm going to use that. So let's start. So I want to graph f of x equals sine of 2x plus pi over 2. And I only want to graph one period. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I know that x is between 0 to 2 pi. One whole period is from 0 to 2 pi. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this thing inside and I'm going to plug it into the x. Okay, so what I'm going to get is 0 is less than or equal to all the way to 2 pi. And then what I'm going to have inside is just going to be 2x plus pi over 2. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and minus pi over 2 to all three sides. This is going to go away. I'm left with 2x is less than or equal to. This is going to give me what? 3 pi over 4. And this is going to give me negative pi over 2. Okay. It should be 3 pi over 2. That's wrong. 3 pi over 2. Okay, this is going to be 3 pi over 2. All right. Then I'm going to go ahead and divide by 2 to all three sides. And what I'm going to get is that x is between negative pi over 4 and also between 3 pi over 4. So this part is where my period is now going to start. Here is where it's now going to end. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and draw my coordinate plane. Notice that there's no amplitude, so there's nothing there. There's also no vertical shift, so all I really have to worry about is my starting and my ending. So I know that it starts at negative pi over 4 and it ends at 3 pi over 2. I'm sorry, 3 pi over 4. And the way that we go ahead and plot these points, we want to figure out the three middle points. So we're going to add these two numbers and divide them by 2. So 3 pi over 4 plus negative pi over 4 divided by 2 is going to give me positive pi over 4. Negative pi over 4 plus pi over 4 divided by 2 is just going to give me 0. So that's my next point. And then this point, when I add negative pi over 4 plus 3, positive pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4 and divided by 2, I'm going to get pi over 2. Okay. And since my amplitude was not changed, this is still going to be from 1 to negative 1. And now all I have to remember is how does the sine curve look like? The sine starts at 0 here, then it goes up, center, minimum, center. And if I go ahead and draw the first period, it looks something like that, and obviously it can keep going. Okay, so that's how I usually solve these inequalities. How do I find the 5 major points? I'm using inequalities, but many of you guys have probably used phase shift. So if you're good with this, you don't need to, you can pause the video and you can stop paying attention. But if you really want to know how you can find the phase shift, you can continue on. So with the phase shift, you need to make sure that your function itself is in the form a sine b parentheses x minus c plus d. Now the period, the sine curve will complete one full period when you take 2 pi and divide it by b, okay, whatever this b term is. The phase shift is it's basically the horizontal shift. I'll write that there. So remember when we shifted left or right? Well, that's what we call it with trig functions. It's called the phase shift. Now, what I want is I want to make this equation look like this equation. So if I go ahead and take a look at it, f of x is equal to sine of 2x plus pi over 2. Well, it doesn't quite look like that because notice how this x is by itself. So I need to get this x by itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor the 2 out. So I'm going to take out the 2. Then I'm going to have x plus, when I take out a 2 here, this is where it gets a little complicated. What I get is pi over 4 because I took out a 2 out. What you can do is you can basically divide pi over 2 divided by 2, and that gives you the pi over 4. Okay, so now I have it in the form that I want. I have it in this form. And in this case, we can see that the phase shift C is equal to pi over 4. And notice that this is positive. This part is positive. So that means it's going to be pi over 4 units to the left. If you remember the graph transformations, it's going to be pi over 4 units to the left. So that's where it's basically going to start. It's going to start at pi over 4. Oh, well, negative pi over 4, because it's going to be pi over 4 units to the left. Then my period, so period, is going to be 2 pi over b. In this case, the b term is going to be 2. So I'm going to get 2 pi over 2, which gives me pi. So that means it's going to complete a period. The period itself is pi units. So it's going to start pi over 4 units to the left. So if I draw it, it might be easier to draw. The sine curve starts at 0, and it's going to start pi over 4 units to the right, and that's that negative pi over 4. So it starts at negative pi over 4, and it's going to end pi units after that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take negative pi over 4, and I'm going to add it to when it completes one full period at pi units. This is going to give me 3 pi over 4. This is where it's going to end. So it ends at 3 pi over 4. And what I'm left with, well, I'm left with this exactly the same thing. So I can find my midpoint. My midpoint here is going to be pi over 4. This is going to be 0. This is going to be pi over 2. Okay, and notice that it's exactly the same thing that I got here. And I can continue my graph. Now, you can use whichever method you want. For me, I prefer to solve an inequality. For you, if you don't like solving inequalities, then you can always use the phase shift. I don't care. I know how to do both of them. If you know how to do one and prefer the other, then you can do whichever you'd like. But they both will give you the same answer. Okay?